My wife brought lunch to an old man every single day for 6 months. I thought she was betraying me. I was wrong about everything. That is where this story begins, not with courage, not with headlines. It begins inside a Durham, North Carolina apartment that was too small for two people carrying too much. Second floor, east side. A building where the elevator had not worked since November and the hallway always smelled like someone else's life. Before we move on, tell me in the comments which state you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode may touch a story that is still unfolding. Zara Washington was 32 years old. She worked mornings at a hospital cafeteria on Roxborough Road and 3 nights a week at a distribution warehouse off Interstate 85. She was studying for her licensed practical nurse certification on the evenings she could keep her eyes open. She was tired in the way that working people in this country are tired. Not loudly, not dramatically, deeply and without end. Her husband, Demarion Washington, was 37. He drove a delivery truck for a logistics company out of Raleigh, came home with sore shoulders and quiet pride, and loved his wife the way men love women they chose correctly, steadily, without performance. Their apartment told the whole story without saying a word. A second-hand couch with a throw blanket covering the worn armrest. Bills pinned to a corkboard beside the refrigerator because she needed to see exactly what was owed. A windowsill with 3 small plants she refused to let die even when she forgot to water them for days. The first morning Demarion noticed something was different. It was a Tuesday in late March. He had woken before 5:30 in the morning to use the bathroom and expected to find his wife asleep when he returned. Instead, he heard her in the kitchen, soft sounds, the plastic wrap rolling out, the thermos lid clicking shut. He stood in the hallway doorway and watched. She was already in her work uniform, moving efficiently, making 2 sandwiches, not one, wrapping them separately, carefully, like they carried meaning. He did not ask. He went back to bed and told himself it was nothing. But the next morning she was up again at 5:15 in the morning, and the morning after that, and every morning after that. The same routine every single day. 2 sandwiches, a banana, coffee poured into the old green thermos. Then gone before 6 in the morning, moving through the dark Durham streets toward the bus stop on Fayetteville Street. The hospital cafeteria did not open until 7:30 in the morning. That gap, 45 minutes, maybe more. It lodged itself in his chest like a splinter, not painful enough to demand attention, too sharp to be forgotten. 2 weeks passed. Demarion said nothing. He was a reasonable man. Reasonable men do not invent problems before breakfast. But reasonable men who love their wives and start feeling unexplained edges will eventually do the one thing they are most ashamed of later. They follow. Doubt does not arrive with noise. It arrives like weather, slowly, quietly, until you realize it has been raining inside you for weeks and you never once stopped to close the window. Demarion Washington was not a jealous man by nature. He did not monitor his wife's movements. He had married Zara because he trusted her in a way that felt structural, the way you trust the floor beneath you without thinking about it. You only notice that trust when something shifts. Something had shifted. The lunches packed with a care that exceeded what 2 people on tight budgets should spend. The pre-dawn departures stretched beyond her schedule's requirements. The way she came home with something behind her eyes she folded away before she kissed him hello. Not guilt exactly, not sadness exactly. Something weighted and private. He asked her once, casually, where she went before her shift. She said she liked to sit near the park on Fayetteville Street, clear her head before the day started. It was the kind of answer that is technically true and still hides the whole shape of the truth. Demarion had heard enough half-answers in 37 years to recognize the texture of one. He told himself he believed her. He did not believe her. The morning he decided to follow his wife, he felt sick about it before he even put on his shoes. He dressed quietly, slipped out 10 minutes before her, and positioned himself half a block down Fayetteville Street near a closed dry-cleaning shop, standing with his collar turned up, hands in his jacket pockets, a man pretending to be somewhere he had every right to be. He watched her come out of their building at 6:05 in the morning, lunch bag in her left hand, thermos in her right, no hesitation, no checking over her shoulder. She turned north on Fayetteville Street and moved through the early morning dark like she owned the quiet. Demarion followed at half a block, far enough to disappear, close enough to see. She did not go to any park. She walked 4 blocks north, crossed at the light near the old hardware store, and continued toward a bus shelter in front of a shuttered laundromat. The neighborhood was barely stirring. A garbage truck somewhere in the next block. A light coming on in a second-floor window above them. He expected to see a man. He had spent 2 weeks building a silhouette in his mind. Younger, perhaps, or simply different. Some absence in their marriage made human and standing at a bus stop. He had prepared himself for the specific burning pain of that sight. What he saw stopped the breath in his chest entirely. An old man, wrapped in a blanket the color of old moss, sleeping on flattened cardboard, knees drawn up, a plastic bag of belongings at his feet. And Zara knelt beside him without hesitation. She set down the bag, put her hand gently on the man's shoulder, woke him, unwrapped a sandwich, poured coffee from the green thermos, handed him a banana with the ease of someone who has done this so many times it has become something close to prayer. Demarian checked his watch. He stood there for 7 full minutes. Then he walked home, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, stared at the corkboard full of bills until the words blurred. He had followed his wife across 4 blocks of Durham, North Carolina, because he thought she was betraying him. She was feeding a homeless man his breakfast. He set down his cup, pressed both hands flat on the table, breathed. A man who discovers he was wrong does not always become better immediately. Sometimes the shame sits first, heavy, private, a sentence he administers to himself because no other punishment feels fair enough. Demarian drove his delivery route through Raleigh and across Wake County that morning without once being fully present in it. His mind stayed back on that corner of Fayetteville Street, on the image of his wife kneeling in the early dark beside a man the city had decided did not exist. He went back the next morning. He told himself it was to understand. That was partly true. Same awning, same turned collar. 6:08 in the morning, the sun still pulling itself above the Durham rooftops. Zara arrived at 6:12. The old man was already awake this time, sitting up against the shelter wall with his blanket across his shoulders, watching the street with the particular calm of someone who had spent years learning to read the difference between people who meant him harm and people who did not. When he saw Zara, something changed in his face. Not a smile exactly, deeper than a smile, recognition mixed with relief. The expression of a person who had been waiting for something they were not fully certain would come, and then it came. He sat up straighter. Demarian watched from his position half a block away as they talked. He was too far to hear the words, but he could see the rhythm. Zara leaning forward slightly, the old man's hands moving, gesturing at something in the distance or in the past. Zara nodding, sometimes looking away briefly, processing something, then looking back. These were not 2 strangers at a bus stop. They were 2 people who knew each other. The old man's name was Elijah Tate, 71 years old. He had been sleeping at that bus shelter on Fayetteville Street for nearly 8 months before Zara ever walked past him. Most people did exactly what you would expect at 6 in the morning. They looked at their phones. They looked at the sky. They looked at anything that was not a man on cardboard reminding them that something was broken in the country they lived in. Elijah had sharp eyes, brown and steady. He spoke with a precision that did not match the cardboard and the blanket and the trash bag beside him. When he talked about his past, there was a specificity to it that Zara would later describe as the thing that first confused her, and then slowly over weeks began to disturb her in a different way. He spoke about flying classified military missions, diplomatic transports, operations that existed in no public record. Zara had listened without correcting him. Not because she believed every word, but because she understood that the truth or fiction of his stories was beside the point. He was a person. Someone needed to listen. What Demarian saw that second morning, from his position in the shadow of that awning, cut through the last threads of his manufactured doubt. Elijah held out half his sandwich to Zara. She took it. Demarian understood then what receipts and early mornings had only partially shown him. His wife was not giving from surplus. She was stretching what little they had to the absolute edge of possible, and somewhere in that stretching she was going hungry herself. He walked home before she could see him, sat on the edge of the bed, waited. He had been wrong about what she was hiding, wrong about what the secret meant, and he had been for 2 full months too afraid of his own suspicion to ask the one question that actually mattered. Elijah Tate had once been the kind of man governments send into places they never intend to discuss publicly. Zara did not know this during the first weeks. What she knew was simpler. He was always awake before she arrived, which meant he was not sleeping well. He drank his coffee black and held the thermos with both hands, suggesting the warmth mattered as much as the caffeine. He had a way of looking at her when she spoke that made her feel genuinely heard, which was not a small thing for a black woman in her 30s working 2 jobs in North Carolina who spent most days being looked past rather than at. She learned his full name by the end of the first week. Elijah Isaiah Tate. He introduced himself with the formality of a man raised to do so regardless of circumstance. The stories started in April, brief at first, fragments offered like samples. He mentioned helicopters the way another man mentions construction work, a past that was real but distant. He mentioned places not by name but by description, mountain terrain, river crossings, cities that meant something different in the 80s than the 90s. By May, the stories had grown into full accounts. Classified extraction missions during conflicts that had never fully made the American news cycle. Diplomatic transports through airspace the government had officially not entered. A 3-letter agency he refused to name but described by its culture of institutional silence. He said these things quietly, without melodrama. Zara listened the way compassion teaches you to listen, not leaning forward with fascination, not leaning back with skepticism, staying present, receiving the emotion beneath the content rather than auditing the content itself. She assumed privately that some portion of it was a mind building itself a more bearable version of its own past. She had seen this before. She did not correct him. She brought his coffee and his sandwich and she listened. DeMarion came back a 3rd morning. He parked his delivery truck on the near end of the block before his route started and watched through the windshield at 6:15 in the morning. From that distance, he watched his wife be, without any visible effort, more fully herself than he had seen her be in months. He drove away carrying something he could not name, not jealousy anymore. Jealousy had burned through itself and come out on the other side. What remained was quieter and more complicated. Pride, grief, a recognition that his wife had a depth of character he had known about in theory but had only now seen operating under actual conditions. He went home and made dinner for the first time in 3 weeks. Zara came home to rice and beans and her favorite hot sauce already on the table. She looked at him with a question she did not ask out loud. He said only that he had felt like cooking. She sat down. He sat across from her. They talked about other things, her nursing courses, his route, a neighbor's dog barking for 3 consecutive nights. He looked at his wife across that small table and said nothing about Fayetteville Street. But the lie he had been building about her in his own mind was completely gone. In its place was something he had not expected at all. Gratitude. A life that is barely keeping itself together does not look the way people imagine from the outside. From the outside, Zara Washington appeared to be managing. She showed up on time. She worked her shifts without complaint. She spoke to cafeteria visitors with a warmth her supervisor, Miss Odessa Bright, described in a performance review as a natural gift. She came home, cooked when she had energy, studied when she had focus, slept when she had nothing left. From the inside, the math never worked. The apartment cost $820 a month. Her take-home pay from the cafeteria was $315 a week. 3 nights at the warehouse added $160. Combined, after bus fare, medical debt minimum payments from an emergency room visit 18 months earlier, and the community college course fees she paid in small installments, she brought home roughly $2,000 a month in Durham, North Carolina, where $2,000 a month was not enough. The gap between what came in and what life cost was not dramatic. It was quiet, cumulative. The electric bill staying 2 weeks past due not because she forgot, but because the bus fare came first. The nursing textbook bought used from a classmate because the $40 difference went toward groceries. It was always the peanut butter. DeMarion found it one evening in late May while putting away groceries. He opened the cabinet above the kitchen counter and found a single large jar of peanut butter, a loaf of bread, and a small notebook in Zara's handwriting. He was not snooping. He was simply putting things away. But the notebook was right there open, and he was reading before he knew he was doing it. 14 sandwiches she had written, maybe 16 if I spread it thin. He stood at that open cabinet for a long time. He found the receipts pinned inside the cabinet door, lean in a way that made his chest hurt. Eggs, bread, peanut butter. bananas in a bunch because they went further that way, rice and dried beans because the dried ones stretched further than canned. She had been feeding Elijah Tate from the same budget she used to feed herself, not from any surplus, from the same carefully stretched arithmetic that kept her own kitchen at the edge of enough. She had told him nothing, not from shame. He understood now that she had made a private decision about what was possible, done the math in her own head, determined it could be done with discipline, and proceeded without drama, without announcement, without asking anyone's permission, including his. This was the woman he had married. He went to the store early the next morning, bought a second jar of peanut butter, 2 loaves of bread, bananas, granola bars, put everything on the counter without a note. When Zara came into the kitchen at 5:20 in the morning and saw it, she stopped. She turned. He was standing in the bedroom doorway. She said quietly, "Did you follow me?" Not a question. She had always known it was possible. She had simply waited to see if he would be honest. He said yes. She turned back to the counter, picked up the peanut butter, said, "I was going to tell you." He said, "I know." She made 2 sandwiches, wrapped them, poured the coffee, picked up the lunch bag, stopped at the door, turned back. "You want to come?" Also not a question. He put on his shoes. They walked to the bus shelter on Fayetteville Street together for the first time on a Tuesday morning in early June. The sky was the color of old iron. The sun was still deciding whether to commit to the day. Their footsteps sounded close together on the empty sidewalk, and neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was a different kind of silence than the one that had been living in their apartment for months. This one was clean. Elijah was awake when they arrived. He always was. He saw Zara first, registered her arrival with a familiar lift of the chin. Then he saw Demarian and went still. Not afraid, just reading. Zara said, "Elijah, this is my husband, Demarian." The old man looked at Demarian for a long moment. Demarian stood straight and did not fill the silence with anything unnecessary. Elijah said, "She talks about you." Demarian said, "Good things, I hope." Elijah said, "Truthful things." He nodded once, a verdict rendered. Then he extended his hand. They shook. That morning the 3 of them sat together at the bus shelter for 12 minutes before the 6:30 bus came. Zara unwrapped the sandwiches, gave one to Elijah, kept one for herself. Demarian had not brought anything and accepted without ceremony the half Elijah quietly held out to him 10 minutes later. It was peanut butter spread thin. He ate it. For 2 weeks after that, it was the 3 of them on the mornings Demarian's depot schedule allowed. He listened to Elijah's stories with the same deliberate openness Zara had modeled, without judgment, without the need to validate or disprove. He heard about the classified extractions, the diplomatic transports, the Eastern European conflict that had no public name, the senator transported to safety over hostile terrain while gripping the seat frame of a helicopter and praying into his collar. Demarian was a practical man. He believed in what could be confirmed, but Elijah's precision was difficult to dismiss. The specific dates offered carefully, the quiet authority with which he spoke about operational security 30 years after the fact. Something in those details moved slowly in Demarian the way slow knowledge moves, not sudden, a gradual unlocking. One morning in mid-June, Demarian asked Elijah directly, "Why are you here?" He did not mean the bus stop. He meant here in this condition after all of that. Elijah looked at the street. A delivery van passed slowly. A door opened and closed somewhere behind them. He said, "The system lost my file," without bitterness. He said, 2 years after I came home, my VA record was in the wrong database. By the time someone noticed, I had no address. By the time I tried to correct it, I could not prove on paper that I was the person whose record had been lost. He looked at Demarian. I served 23 years, and I could not prove it. That evening walking home, Zara said she had been thinking that the stories Elijah told might not be stories at all. The precision, the operational language, the way he never embellished. It had stopped feeling like confusion. It had started feeling like fact. Demarian stopped walking, said, "What do we do with that?" Zara said, "He gave me an envelope weeks ago, asked me to mail it if something happened to him." Demarian said, "Where is it?" She said, "In my bag. I haven't opened it." They stood on the sidewalk in the early June evening, streetlights beginning to flicker on above them, and looked at each other in the full specific way that married people look at each other when they understand that what is happening is larger than what they can see. They walked home. The envelope stayed sealed. Neither of them slept well that night. Elijah Tate did not disappear quietly. He collapsed in front of Zara with the full physicality of a man whose body had been held together by discipline alone and had finally reached the limit of what discipline could do. It was a Thursday morning in late June, 6:18 in the morning. Demarion was not with her. His depot required early sign-in on Thursdays and he had left before 5. She had kissed him in the dark of the bedroom doorway and he had pressed his hand briefly to the side of her face and then he was gone. She arrived at the bus shelter with the lunch bag and the thermos, same as always, found Elijah sitting up, but his hands were doing something they had never done before, shaking with a violence that had nothing to do with cold. His breath was coming in shallow, irregular rhythms. He looked at her, and she saw in his eyes not the usual steady calm, but something fragmented, searching. He tried to speak. What came out was not language. The thermos slipped from his hand when she tried to give it to him. It struck the concrete and rolled, coffee spreading across the sidewalk in a dark fan. Then he folded, not slowly, not gracefully. Knees first, then the sideways collapse of his torso, and Zara moved without thought, dropping everything and catching the back of his head before it hit the ground. She screamed for someone to call 911. A woman across the street pulled out her phone. A jogger stopped, looked, kept running. 2 people stepping off the early bus stood and stared. She kept Elijah's head off the concrete, checked his breathing, spoke to him continuously, low and steady, the voice she used with hospital patients in distress. Not panicked, not performative, just present. His lips were pale. His pulse, when she pressed 2 fingers to his neck, was there but erratic. "Stay with me," she said. "Elijah, stay with me." The ambulance arrived 11 minutes later. She climbed in before anyone could stop her. One paramedic asked if she was family. She said, "I am all he has." At Duke Regional Hospital, a nurse guided her to a waiting area with green plastic chairs and fluorescent lights. She texted Demarion one line. Elijah collapsed. At Duke Regional. His response came in 40 seconds. "On my way." The intake clerk was named Keisha Monroe. She needed insurance, identification, emergency contact documentation. Zara said she was his niece. Said he had no documentation because you do not leave important papers in a trash bag at a bus shelter. Said he was a veteran, 23 years of service. Said to check the VA system. Keisha Monroe said she needed proof. A doctor behind them said, "Run it, Keisha." Dr. Solomon Okafor, emergency medicine. He looked at Zara steadily. He said, "If there is a match, he stays." Zara said, "Fair." Keisha typed. 40 seconds of silence that stretched into infinity. Then her expression changed. She said, "There is a match. Elijah Isaiah Tate, honorably discharged 2001. She scrolled. She scrolled again. She said, "Service record is heavily redacted, almost entirely blacked out." Dr. Okafor moved behind the desk and read. He said, "Transfer him to Ward B. I will handle the VA authorization personally." He looked at Zara. "You can see him in about an hour. He is stable." He paused. "You did the right thing bringing him in." Demarion arrived 20 minutes later. He did not ask questions. He sat beside her and took her hand, and they waited together in that fluorescent-lit room in Durham, North Carolina, while a man whose entire service record had been erased was finally, for the first time in years, being treated as though he deserved to exist. He said, "The system lost my file," without bitterness. He said, 2 years after I came home, my VA record was in the wrong database. By the time someone noticed, I had no address. By the time I tried to correct it, I could not prove on paper that I was the person whose record had been lost. He looked at Demarion. "I served 23 years, and I could not prove it." That evening walking home, Zara said she had been thinking that the stories Elijah told might not be stories at all. The precision, the operational language, the way he never embellished. It had stopped feeling like confusion. It had started feeling like fact. Demarion stopped walking, said, "What do we do with that?" Zara said, "He gave me an envelope weeks ago, asked me to mail it if something happened to him." Demarion said, "Where is it?" She said, "In my bag. I haven't opened it." They stood on the sidewalk in the early June evening, streetlights beginning to flicker on above them, and looked at each other in the full specific way that married people look at each other when they understand that what is happening is larger than what they can see. They walked home. The envelope stayed sealed. Neither of them slept well that night. Elijah Tate did not disappear quietly. He collapsed in front of Zara with the full physicality of a man whose body had been held together by discipline alone and had finally reached the limit of what discipline could do. It was a Thursday morning in late June, 6:18 in the morning. Demarian was not with her. His depot required early sign-in on Thursdays and he had left before 5. She had kissed him in the dark of the bedroom doorway and he had pressed his hand briefly to the side of her face and then he was gone. She arrived at the bus shelter with the lunch bag and the thermos, same as always, found Elijah sitting up, but his hands were doing something they had never done before, shaking with a violence that had nothing to do with cold. His breath was coming in shallow, irregular rhythms. He looked at her, and she saw in his eyes not the usual steady calm, but something fragmented, searching. He tried to speak. What came out was not language. The thermos slipped from his hand when she tried to give it to him. It struck the concrete and rolled, coffee spreading across the sidewalk in a dark fan. Then he folded, not slowly, not gracefully. Knees first, then the sideways collapse of his torso, and Zara moved without thought, dropping everything and catching the back of his head before it hit the ground. She screamed for someone to call 911. A woman across the street pulled out her phone. A jogger stopped, looked, kept running. 2 people stepping off the early bus stood and stared. She kept Elijah's head off the concrete, checked his breathing, spoke to him continuously, low and steady, the voice she used with hospital patients in distress. Not panicked, not performative, just present. His lips were pale. His pulse, when she pressed 2 fingers to his neck, was there but erratic. "Stay with me," she said. "Elijah, stay with me." The ambulance arrived 11 minutes later. She climbed in before anyone could stop her. One paramedic asked if she was family. She said, "I am all he has." At Duke Regional Hospital, a nurse guided her to a waiting area with green plastic chairs and fluorescent lights. She texted Demarian one line. Elijah collapsed. At Duke Regional. His response came in 40 seconds. "On my way." The intake clerk was named Keisha Monroe. She needed insurance, identification, emergency contact documentation. Zara said she was his niece. Said he had no documentation because you do not leave important papers in a trash bag at a bus shelter. Said he was a veteran, 23 years of service. Said to check the VA system. Keisha Monroe said she needed proof. A doctor behind them said, "Run it, Keisha." Dr. Solomon Okafor, emergency medicine. He looked at Zara steadily. He said, "If there is a match, he stays." Zara said, "Fair." Keisha typed, 40 seconds of silence that stretched into infinity. Then her expression changed. She said, "There is a match. Elijah Isaiah Tate, honorably discharged 2001. She scrolled. She scrolled again. She said, "Service record is heavily redacted, almost entirely blacked out." Dr. Okafor moved behind the desk and read. He said, "Transfer him to Ward B. I will handle the VA authorization personally." He looked at Zara. "You can see him in about an hour. He is stable." He paused. "You did the right thing bringing him in." Demarian arrived 20 minutes later. He did not ask questions. He sat beside her and took her hand, and they waited together in that fluorescent-lit room in Durham, North Carolina, while a man whose entire service record had been erased was finally, for the first time in years, being treated as though he deserved to exist. 3 weeks after the letter was mailed, they came to the door. It was 6:12 in the morning. Zara was in her hospital uniform, lacing her shoes. The coffee had gone cold on the counter because she had forgotten it in the rush of a morning that had started 12 minutes late. Demarian was in the kitchen eating standing up, delivery jacket on, keys already in hand. The knock was not loud. It was firm, official, the kind that does not need volume because the person making it has never once needed to raise their voice to be taken seriously. Demarian was closer. He opened the door. 3 people in United States Army dress uniforms filled the narrow hallway, brass buttons catching the dim building light. The man in front was tall and composed with the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades requiring other people to hold themselves together while he quietly assessed everything. His name tag read Colonel Marcus Webb. Demarian said nothing. He turned his head toward the kitchen. Zara appeared in the doorway. "Colonel Webb," said Miss Washington. His voice was measured and certain. He used her maiden name. "Ma'am, I am Colonel Marcus Webb. These are Officers Lieutenant Brianna Stiles and Lieutenant Andre Pemberton. We are here about Elijah Tate." The world did not tilt dramatically. It shifted. The way a scale shifts when the final weight is placed. Zara said yes. The colonel said General Adiz Akafer received your letter. She paused. 3 weeks ago, she wants to meet you. The hallway was completely silent. Demarian stood with his keys still in his hand, his delivery route beginning in 40 minutes across Wake County, and he looked at his wife standing in the kitchen doorway and felt the full accumulated weight of the past 6 months organize itself into one clear, final understanding. He understood now why Elijah had chosen this specific woman and no one else. Zara said, "Why does she want to meet me?" Colonel Webb said, "That is the general's story to tell, not mine." She said, "When?" He said, "We fly from Raleigh-Durham Airport at 2:30 this afternoon, if you are willing." Demarian said, "My wife will need time to prepare." The colonel said, "We anticipated that." He produced a card, tomorrow if she preferred, or the day after. The general considered this a matter of priority. Zara looked at Demarian. He nodded once. She turned back and said, "Today, 2:30 is fine." The officers left, their footsteps measured and receding in the hallway. The building door opened and closed. Silence returned. Demarian set his keys on the table. He was going to be late. He would call the depot. Zara looked at him and said, "I need to call Miss Bright." He said, "I know." She said, "I don't know what this is." He said, "I do." He said it plainly. No performance. He said, "It is what happens when someone does the right thing for long enough that it cannot be ignored anymore. Elijah knew exactly what he was doing when he gave you that letter." She said, "He was just an old man at a bus stop." Demarian said, "He was a man who had been waiting for someone worth trusting. He found you." She packed a small bag. He drove her to Raleigh-Durham Airport. At the departure gate, he held her face in both hands the way he had in the dark of the bedroom doorway months ago, when the whole story was only beginning, and neither of them could see where it was going. He said, "You didn't do anything wrong." She said, "I know." He said, "I was wrong. For 2 months I was wrong about you. I am sorry." She said, "You made me rice and beans. I already forgave you." He pulled her close and held her. Then she walked through security with a small bag and a quiet, settled calm, and the particular uprightness of a woman who has been carrying more than anyone around her knows, and has decided that it is simply the weight of being who she is. Demarian stood at the window and watched the plane rise above the Carolina pines until it was gone. He drove home through Raleigh and waited. The Senate Armed Services Committee convened on the second Thursday of October. Zara sat at the witness table in a navy blue suit that fit her exactly. General Adiz Akafer had arranged it, not as a transformation, as a simple act of respect. "You wear what allows the room to hear you," the general had said. "Everything else is noise." General Adiz Akafer was 61 years old, 4 stars, silver locks pulled back, eyes that measured rooms and found their weight in a single glance. She had received Elijah's letter and cross-referenced it against an active Inspector General review into the VA's handling of veterans with classified service records. 43 confirmed cases of veterans lost between an incompatible classified tracking database and the general VA benefits system, a gap that had been swallowing people whole for 20 years. Elijah Tate had fallen into that gap. He had told the truth every morning at a bus shelter in Durham, North Carolina, and no one who passed him had believed it, until a 32-year-old woman barely keeping her own life together had decided that the truth of his stories mattered less than the fact of his existence. That distinction, General Akafer told the committee, was the thing she needed them to understand. She testified first, standing before the Senate Armed Services Committee without notes, speaking the language of institutional failure with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 40 years operating inside the institution. She named Elijah Tate, named his service, named the missions that could now be named, named the 43 confirmed cases and the probable hundreds more. Then Zara stood. She walked to the witness table, sat down. The microphone was adjusted. Every face in the room turned toward her. She had written a prepared testimony. She had practiced it. She had listened politely to the communications team's notes about what to emphasize and what to soften. Then that morning she had folded the pages and put them in her jacket pocket and left them there. She said, "I met Elijah in March at a bus shelter on Fayetteville Street in Durham, North Carolina. I started bringing him breakfast, a sandwich, coffee, nothing that would impress anyone. I didn't know he was a veteran. He told me stories about classified missions and I thought he was confused. She paused. I didn't believe him, but I brought breakfast anyway, because it didn't matter whether the stories were true. He was still a person. Senator Camille Douglas of North Carolina leaned forward and asked how long. Zara said 6 months. Every single morning, the senator asked why. Zara said because no one else did, because he was someone's grandfather, because the world had decided he did not exist, and I was raised in North Carolina to look at people. Senator Radford Gaines of Georgia leaned forward with the practiced skepticism of a man who has managed other people's, suffering long enough to mistake management for understanding. He asked if she was suggesting the federal government should fund care for every homeless individual in America. The room went quiet. Zara looked at him. She said, "No, Senator, I'm talking about Elijah Tate specifically, a man who flew the people who make decisions about wars to and from the places those decisions were made." She did not raise her voice. She said, "When you sent him into those operations, you made him a promise. I kept mine with a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. She let that sit. You kept yours with a database error and 30 years of silence." Senator Gaines opened his mouth, closed it. General Okafor rose. She announced the dedicated VA task force for veterans with classified records, the Elijah Tate Memorial Fund, $5 million in initial federal allocation. She looked at Zara. She announced her appointment as community liaison. Afterward in the hallway, a reporter's voice cut through the crowd. "How does it feel to change policy?" Zara stopped. She said, "I didn't change policy. Elijah Tate changed policy. I just made sure the letter got mailed." That line was on every network by evening. DeMarion watched it from their East Durham apartment, sitting on the couch under the throw blanket that covered the worn armrest, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching his wife speak before the United States Senate with the same steadiness with which she had knelt beside a man on cardboard at 6 in the morning when no one was watching and there was nothing to gain. He sat in the quiet of that apartment and felt something settle permanently in his chest. Something that had been shifting for months, finally finding its place. She came home late that night. He was waiting at the door. She walked in and set down her bag and they stood in the kitchen under the fluorescent light beside the corkboard full of bills, and she looked at him and he looked at her and no words were necessary. Some things do not need to be said to be permanently true. Outside, Durham was quiet. Fayetteville Street was quiet. The bus shelter where Elijah Tate had slept on flattened cardboard for 8 months sat empty under the streetlight, the way it would from now on. Not forgotten, witnessed. That is the difference, and Zara Washington had always known it. If you enjoyed this story, like this video, and leave a comment telling me what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to get alerts for new stories like this one. Thanks for watching.